The old woman's knees hit the cold kitchen floor with a dull thud. Soap water spilled across the tiles, soaking her worn uniform as her hands trembled uncontrollably. Her breath came short and shallow, chest rising in panic. Above her, a sharp female voice cut through the air like a blade. "Clean it again." I said again. The woman tried to stand, but her body failed her. Her eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. In that moment, she was not weak, but she was breaking. Then suddenly, the front door creaked open. Footsteps stopped. Silence swallowed the room. A man stood frozen at the entrance, staring at the scene before him. His face drained of color as his eyes locked onto the woman on the floor. And in that instant, everything was about to change. Before we enter this story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your country. And if you love powerful stories about life truth and moral lessons, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Margaret Okoye had lived long enough to understand one painful truth about life. People revealed who they truly were when they believed no one important was watching. For over 60 years, she had carried herself with quiet dignity. Widowed early, she had raised her only son with discipline, faith, and sacrifice. There were nights she went to bed hungry so Daniel could eat. Years she wore the same faded dresses while paying for his education. She never complained, never asked for praise. Watching her son rise to become one of Lagos's most respected billionaires had been her greatest reward. Daniel Okoye was now the CEO of Okoye Developments, a construction and infrastructure empire stretching across Nigeria and beyond. His name commanded respect in boardrooms and government offices. But to Margaret, he was still the boy who once cried when she left him at school. When Daniel announced he was getting married, Margaret had smiled, truly smiled. The woman he planned to marry was Vanessa Adebayo. Beautiful, polished, confident. She came from a good family, spoke elegantly, dressed impeccably, and knew exactly how to behave around powerful people. In public, she was grace itself. Yet something about Vanessa unsettled Margaret. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't fear of losing her son. It was instinct, the kind only a mother develops after decades of watching human behavior. Vanessa was kind when Daniel was present, warm, gentle, respectful. But whenever she thought no one important was watching, her eyes changed. Her smile vanished too quickly. Her patience snapped without warning. Margaret noticed the small things. How Vanessa barely greeted the gatekeeper. How she snapped her fingers at waiters in restaurants. How her voice sharpened when speaking to drivers or cleaners. Daniel didn't see it. Or perhaps he didn't want to. He loves her, Margaret told herself one evening as she sat alone in her modest apartment in Surulere. But love should not make a man blind. She prayed about it, long and hard. Margaret was not a woman who interfered lightly. She respected boundaries. She believed adults must choose their own paths, but she also believed that marriage revealed a person's true nature, and once entered, it was not easily escaped. If Vanessa lacked kindness now, what would she become after marriage? After children, after power. One afternoon, Margaret visited Daniel's mansion unannounced. The house was vast white walls, marble floors, glass railings, and quiet luxury in every corner. Yet it felt strangely cold to her, too perfect, too controlled. Vanessa greeted her at the door with a bright smile. "Mummy, you should have called," she said, leaning in for a quick hug that didn't quite reach her eyes. Margaret smiled back. "I was nearby. I just wanted to see you." Vanessa nodded, already distracted by her phone. "Please sit. I'll ask the maid to bring you something." Margaret watched as Vanessa snapped her fingers toward the kitchen without even turning her head. "Aisha, bring water." The tone made Margaret's heart sink. "Aisha." The house help rushed out immediately, head lowered. In that moment, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. That evening, Margaret returned home and packed a small bag. She chose her oldest clothes: simple wrappers, faded blouses, flat sandals. She removed her jewelry: no earrings, no necklace, not even her wedding ring. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. "You are doing this for your son," she whispered, "not to destroy, but to protect." The next morning, Margaret called Daniel. "My son," she said gently, "I've been feeling lonely. I thought maybe I could stay close to you for a while." Daniel hesitated. "Mum, you know you're always welcome, but the house is busy now. Vanessa is planning the wedding." "I don't want to disturb," Margaret said quickly. "Actually, I was thinking perhaps I could work." Daniel laughed softly. "Work, Mum? You don't need." "I know," she interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "But I want to. Just something small. I heard you were looking for an extra helper in the house." There was a pause. "You want to work as staff?" Daniel asked, confused. "Yes," Margaret replied. "No one needs to know who I am. Let me see how things truly are in your home." Daniel was silent for a long time. "Mum, are you sure I am?" she said. "Please." Against his better judgment, Daniel agreed. He thought his mother was simply bored. He never imagined the test she was about to conduct. 2 days later, Margaret returned to the mansion, not as Daniel Okoye's mother, but as Madame Maggie, a middle-aged woman looking for work. Vanessa barely glanced at her. "You're old," Vanessa said bluntly, scanning her from head to toe. "Can you even handle cleaning?" Margaret lowered her eyes. "I will try, madam." Vanessa sighed. "Fine. Aisha will show you what to do. But don't be slow. I hate laziness." Margaret nodded respectfully. Inside, her heart ached, not for herself, but for what this behavior revealed. As Vanessa turned and walked away, heels clicking sharply against the floor, Margaret whispered silently, "So this is who you are, when you think you have power." That night, Margaret lay awake in the small staff room, staring at the ceiling. She knew the path ahead would not be easy. She would be insulted, dismissed, humiliated. But she was ready, because a woman who could endure poverty, loss, and sacrifice for her child could endure anything, especially the truth. And soon that truth would come to light. Margaret's first morning as Madame Maggie began before sunrise. The staff quarters behind the mansion were quiet, wrapped in the soft blue light of early dawn. She rose slowly from her narrow bed, her joints aching slightly, but her resolve firm. She tied her wrapper carefully, slipped her feet into worn sandals, and whispered a short prayer under her breath. "Give me strength, and give me clarity." By the time the main house stirred awake, Margaret was already sweeping the courtyard. The broom scratched softly against the tiles, a rhythm she knew well from years past. There was nothing unfamiliar about the work itself. What felt unfamiliar was doing it under another woman's authority, especially one young enough to be her daughter. Vanessa emerged from the bedroom wing just after 7. She wore a silk robe, hair perfectly wrapped, phone pressed to her ear. She didn't greet anyone. Her eyes scanned the courtyard, landed on Margaret, and narrowed slightly. "You," she said sharply, snapping her fingers. "Come." Margaret set the broom aside and walked over, head bowed slightly. "Yes, madam." Vanessa wrinkled her nose. "Didn't anyone teach you how to sweep properly? The corners are still dusty." Margaret looked down. There was barely a speck of dirt. "I will redo it," she said softly. Vanessa waved her hand dismissively. "And hurry. I don't like repeating myself." She turned and walked away, already dialing another number. Margaret returned to her work without a word. But inside her chest, something tightened. Aisha watched from the doorway. Later, when Vanessa had left for a brunch meeting, Aisha approached Margaret quietly. "Please don't mind her," Aisha whispered. "She's difficult." Margaret gave a small smile. "Thank you, my daughter." Aisha hesitated. "If you need help, just tell me." Margaret nodded. "I appreciate that." Throughout the day, Margaret was given task after task. Wash the windows, then redo them, because Vanessa claimed they were streaky. Prepare vegetables, then throw them away, because Vanessa decided she wanted something else. Mop the living room, then mop it again after Vanessa walked through with muddy shoes. Each instruction came with a sharp tone, never a please, never a thank you. When Daniel came home in the evening, everything changed. Vanessa transformed instantly. Her voice softened. Her smile widened. She slipped her arm through Daniel's, laughing lightly as she told him about her day. "Oh, darling, the wedding planner was exhausting today," she said sweetly. "But I'm so excited." Daniel smiled, kissing her forehead. "You work too hard." Margaret stood nearby, holding a tray of water glasses. Daniel glanced at her. "You must be the new helper." "Thank you for coming." His voice was polite, respectful. Margaret met his eyes briefly, then lowered hers. "You're welcome, sir." Vanessa's smile flickered for just a second. "She's slow," Vanessa added casually. "But Aisha says she'll learn." Daniel frowned slightly. Everyone deserves time to adjust. Vanessa laughed lightly, brushing it off. "Of course." Margaret felt a strange mix of emotions swirl inside her. Pride at her son's kindness, pain at his blindness. That night, as Margaret scrubbed pots in the kitchen, Vanessa stormed in. "Why is dinner not ready yet?" she demanded. "We're almost done," Madame Aisha said quickly. Vanessa's eyes locked onto Margaret. "Almost, or slow again?" Margaret wiped her hands. "I apologize. It will be ready shortly." Vanessa stepped closer, her voice low and cutting. "See that it is? I don't tolerate incompetence." She turned and left. Aisha's shoulders slumped. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Margaret shook her head gently. "This is not your fault." Later after dinner, Daniel went to his study to take a call. Vanessa disappeared into the bedroom. Margaret sat alone in the kitchen, massaging her tired hands. Her thoughts drifted. She remembered Daniel, as a child, helping her fetch water, insisting on carrying buckets too heavy for his small arms. She remembered teaching him to greet elders, to respect everyone, regardless of status. What happened, she wondered quietly. Or has this always been here, hidden? The next few days followed the same pattern. When Daniel was home, Vanessa played the perfect fiancé. When he left, the mask dropped. One afternoon, Vanessa entered the kitchen while Margaret was peeling yams. "Why are you sitting?" Vanessa snapped. Margaret looked up. "I was peeling madam." Vanessa scoffed. "You sit when you rest, not when you work. Stand." Margaret slowly rose to her feet. Vanessa watched her for a moment, then added, "And don't use too much water." "Do you think it's free?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, madam." After Vanessa left, Margaret leaned against the counter, her breath shallow. Aisha rushed over. "Mama, are you okay?" Margaret forced a small smile. "I am." But that night alone in her room, she cried quietly. Not loud sobs, just silent tears sliding down her face. She wasn't crying because of the insults. She had endured worse in life. She was crying because she now knew without doubt that the woman her son planned to marry lacked compassion. And compassion, Margaret believed, was the foundation of any true home. Still, she didn't stop the test. If anything, she leaned into it. She paid closer attention, listened more carefully, observed how Vanessa treated drivers, security guards, vendors at the gate. Each day confirmed her fears. Vanessa believed kindness was weakness. She believed power meant control. She believed respect was something taken, not earned. And worst of all, she believed no one important would ever see her true self. Margaret folded her clothes neatly that evening and sat on her bed, staring at the wall. "This is only the beginning," she whispered. "For both of us." Because what Vanessa did not know was this: every word, every glance, every act of cruelty was being seen and remembered. By the end of the first week, the mansion no longer felt unfamiliar to Margaret. It felt revealing. The walls were the same. The marble floors still shone. The chandeliers still glittered under soft golden light. Yet beneath the beauty, Margaret could now sense the emotional temperature of the house, and it was cold. Vanessa's behavior followed a predictable rhythm. In the mornings, she woke irritable, snapping at everyone within reach. By midday, she became commanding, issuing orders, as if power itself flowed from her voice. And in the evenings, when Daniel returned, she transformed into a picture of warmth and affection, her laughter light, her words gentle, her patience suddenly endless. Margaret watched it all closely. One morning, as Margaret wiped the dining table, Vanessa entered with a clipboard in hand. "I made a list," she announced. "You seem forgetful." Margaret paused. "A list, madam, yes," Vanessa replied, placing it down sharply. "Daily duties. Follow it exactly. No excuses." Margaret picked up the paper. The list was excessive tasks repeated unnecessarily, some contradicting others. Vanessa crossed her arms. "And don't think because you're old, I'll go easy on you. I don't tolerate laziness." Margaret lowered her head. "I understand." Vanessa's eyes lingered on her for a moment, as if searching for resistance. Finding none, she scoffed and walked away. As soon as she was gone, Aisha hurried over. "She's never done this before," Aisha whispered. "She's targeting you." Margaret gave a faint smile. Sometimes people reveal more when they believe they are in control. Aisha frowned. "You speak like someone educated." Margaret chuckled softly. "Life teaches many lessons." Later that afternoon, Daniel returned home earlier than expected. Vanessa greeted him at the door, arms around his neck, her voice soft and musical. "You're early," she said sweetly. Everything okay? Just wanted to come home, Daniel replied, smiling. Where's everyone? In the kitchen, Vanessa said quickly. They're cleaning. Daniel walked toward the kitchen and stopped. Margaret was scrubbing the floor on her knees. Her back was bent. Her hands were red from soap and water. A bucket sat beside her. Daniel frowned. Why is she on the floor? Vanessa's smile tightened. Oh, she made a mess earlier. I told her to clean it properly. Margaret did not look up. Daniel hesitated. Aisha usually handles the floors. Vanessa laughed lightly. She's teaching the new one. Teamwork, you know. Daniel nodded slowly, unconvinced, but unwilling to argue. Thank you, he said to Margaret. You can stop now. Margaret looked up startled. Sir, I said you can stop. Daniel repeated. Vanessa's eyes flashed. Oh no. Darling, she interrupted. If she doesn't finish, she won't learn. Daniel glanced between them. It's fine, Vanessa. For a split second, Vanessa's expression hardened, but she quickly masked it. Of course, she said, forcing a smile. Whatever you say. Margaret stood slowly, her knees stiff. Thank you, sir, she murmured. That night, Vanessa confronted Margaret in the corridor. Don't ever try to use pity on him, she hissed. Margaret looked genuinely confused. Madame Vanessa stepped closer. You think kneeling on the floor will make him feel sorry for you? Don't be foolish. Margaret met her gaze briefly. I did not ask him for help. Vanessa's jaw clenched. Know your place. She walked away. Margaret remained still for a long moment, then continued on her way. Inside her chest, her heart ached, not from fear, but from disappointment. The following day, Vanessa invited her friends over, the living room filled with laughter, perfume, and sharp heels clicking against the floor. Margaret served drinks, quietly moving in and out like a shadow. As she passed behind Vanessa, one of the women wrinkled her nose. Who's that? She asked, not bothering to lower her voice. The new maid Vanessa replied casually. She's manageable. The women laughed softly. Margaret felt the sting, but her face remained calm. Then, as Margaret reached to refill a glass, Vanessa suddenly shifted her arm. The glass tipped. Red wine spilled across the white rug. Vanessa gasped dramatically. Oh my God, what have you done? Margaret froze. I'm sorry. Sorry, Vanessa snapped loudly. Do you know how expensive this rug is? The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Margaret. I will clean it, Margaret said quietly. Vanessa scoffed. Clean it, you've ruined it. She turned to her friends. Honestly, this is why I don't like old staff. They're clumsy. Margaret knelt down immediately, blotting the stain with a cloth. Vanessa stood over her. Careful, she said mockingly. Don't stain your uniform too. Laughter rippled awkwardly around the room. Margaret's hands shook slightly, but she kept working. Later, after the guests left, Aisha approached her eyes full of concern. I'm so sorry, she whispered. She did that on purpose. Margaret nodded. I know. That night, Daniel noticed the stain still faintly visible on the rug. What happened? He asked. Vanessa waved her hand dismissively. The maid was careless. I've already warned her. Daniel frowned, but said nothing. Margaret stood in the doorway unseen. She realized then that this test was not only about Vanessa, it was also about Daniel, about whether he would ever truly see what was happening right in front of him. In her room, Margaret sat on the bed, exhaustion settling deep into her bones. She could stop now, reveal herself, end the charade, but she didn't, because she hadn't yet seen enough. She wanted to know how far Vanessa would go. When there were no witnesses, she feared no image to protect. She wanted to know who her son was truly marrying, and she was willing to endure more to find out. As Margaret lay down to sleep, a quiet resolve filled her heart. The truth she whispered into the darkness always rises. And soon, very soon, it would rise in this house. Margaret began to notice that cruelty, when repeated often enough, always attracted witnesses. They were not always bold witnesses. Sometimes they were silent ones, eyes that looked away too quickly, shoulders that tensed at the sound of approaching footsteps, hands that trembled while holding trays. And among all of them, Aisha was the one who watched the closest. Aisha had worked in the Okoye household for nearly 8 years. She had seen staff come and go, watched Daniel grow from a young professional into a powerful businessman, and observed how the atmosphere of the house shifted the moment Vanessa entered it. But until Margaret arrived, Aisha had never seen anyone endure Vanessa's behavior with such quiet steadiness. One evening, as they washed dishes together, after dinner, Aisha finally spoke. "Mama, Maggie," she said softly, keeping her voice low. "Why do you say nothing?" Margaret glanced at her. "About what my daughter Aisha swallowed, about how she treats you. It's not right." Margaret rinsed a plate slowly. Sometimes, silence allows people to speak more clearly. Aisha frowned. "But it hurts." Margaret met her eyes gently. "Yes, but pain can also reveal truth." Aisha didn't fully understand, but she nodded. Over the next few days, Aisha became Margaret's quiet ally. She showed her where extra supplies were kept, so Vanessa couldn't accuse her of wasting resources. She warned her when Vanessa was in a particularly foul mood. She even stepped in once or twice, taking blame for mistakes that weren't Margaret's. "You don't have to do that," Margaret told her one afternoon. Aisha shrugged. "Someone should." Margaret's respect for the young woman grew. One morning, Vanessa returned from a phone call, visibly irritated. She stormed into the kitchen, heels striking the floor sharply. "Where is my breakfast?" she demanded. "It's almost ready," Madam, Aisha replied quickly. Vanessa's eyes shifted to Margaret. "Almost ready?" Or slow again, Margaret straightened. "It will be served now." She placed the tray carefully on the counter. Vanessa lifted the lid, glanced inside, and scoffed. "Is this how you plate food? Have you never worked in a decent house before?" Margaret remained silent. Vanessa pushed the tray away slightly. "Redo it." Aisha spoke up before she could stop herself. "Madam, the food is fine." Vanessa turned sharply. "Did I ask you?" Aisha's face flushed. "No, madam." "Then mind your work," Vanessa snapped. "Both of you." As Margaret replated the food, she noticed Aisha's hands shaking. Later, when Vanessa left the house, Aisha burst into tears. "I can't take this anymore," she whispered. "She wasn't like this before." Margaret sat beside her. "What do you mean?" Aisha wiped her eyes. "When she first came, she was strict but manageable. But since the wedding plans started, it's like she needs to control everything. Everyone." Margaret listened carefully. "Does Daniel know?" she asked. Aisha shook her head. "No. And if we tell him, she'll deny it. She always does." Margaret nodded slowly. People like that rely on disbelief. That evening, Daniel invited his mother, unaware she was right there to dinner at a restaurant downtown. He wanted to discuss wedding arrangements, guest lists, venues. Vanessa glowed that night. Elegant dress, perfect makeup, polished laughter. At the restaurant entrance, a security guard greeted them. "Good evening, sir." "Good evening, madam." Daniel nodded politely. Vanessa didn't respond. As they walked past, the guard murmured, "Welcome." Vanessa rolled her eyes. "Why do they talk so much?" Daniel glanced at her. "He was just greeting us." Vanessa shrugged. "It's annoying." Margaret, back at the mansion, heard about the dinner later from the driver who spoke quietly to Aisha in the kitchen. "She refused to tip," he said, even after they carried her bags. Aisha sighed. "She never does." Margaret said nothing, but her heart grew heavier. A few days later, Daniel left town for a 2-day business trip. The change was immediate. Vanessa became harsher, her patience thinner. She woke Margaret before dawn, calling her name sharply from the hallway. "Come and clean the guest bathroom," she ordered. "I don't want to smell bleach later." "Yes, madam," Margaret replied. After scrubbing for nearly an hour, Margaret emerged, her back aching. Vanessa inspected the bathroom, running her finger along the sink. She smiled coldly. "Redo it." Margaret looked at the spotless surface. Madam Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "Are you questioning me?" "No," Margaret said calmly. "I will redo it." Vanessa watched her return to her knees, a satisfied glint in her eyes. Later that afternoon, Margaret slipped slightly while carrying laundry down the stairs. She caught herself on the railing, but the basket tumbled clothes spilling onto the floor. Vanessa appeared instantly. "What is this nonsense?" she shouted. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, bending to pick up the clothes. Vanessa laughed bitterly. "Of course you are. Always sorry. Always useless." Aisha rushed over. "Madam, it was an accident." "Enough," Vanessa snapped. "Both of you get out of my sight." As they walked away, Aisha whispered, "She enjoys this." Margaret nodded. "Yes, she does." That night, Margaret sat alone in her small room, her body sore, her spirit weary. She thought of Daniel, of the man he had become, of the woman he believed he was marrying, and she wondered how many people had already suffered in silence because they were invisible to power. The next morning, Margaret overheard Vanessa on the phone. "Yes, I know," Vanessa said, her voice sharp. "Once we're married, things will be different. This house will be mine. I won't have to pretend anymore." Margaret froze. Vanessa continued, unaware she was being heard. "I'm tired of acting nice. People should know their place." Margaret stepped back quietly, her heart pounding. That was the moment she realized the truth was deeper than she feared. This wasn't stress. This wasn't wedding pressure. This was character. And character, once revealed, did not change easily. Margaret sat on her bed, laid her hands clasped together. "The mask is slipping," she whispered, "and soon it will fall." But she also knew something else. Vanessa was growing careless, and careless people always made mistakes. Mistakes that could no longer be hidden. The invitation came without warning. Vanessa announced it casually during breakfast, her tone light, almost cheerful. "I'm having a small gathering this afternoon," she said, scrolling through her phone. "Just a few friends. Keep the house spotless." Margaret nodded. "Yes, madam." Aisha stiffened beside her. She knew what that meant. Whenever Vanessa hosted guests without Daniel present, the house became a stage and the staff unwilling props. By noon, the mansion was polished to perfection. Cushions aligned, floors gleaming, curtains drawn just right, to let sunlight pour in softly, highlighting the luxury Vanessa loved to display. Margaret moved quietly, her body tired, but her focus sharp. She sensed something coming, something heavier than the usual sharp words and unnecessary orders. The guests arrived just after 2. 3 women stepped in, dressed in designer outfits, laughter trailing behind them. Their heels clicked confidently across the marble floor as they embraced Vanessa like royalty. "Oh, Vanessa, this place is stunning," one of them said. Vanessa smiled proudly. "Of course, Daniel has good taste." She turned sharply toward the kitchen. "You bring drinks." Margaret appeared with a tray of chilled juice and wine glasses, head slightly bowed. As she approached, one of the women glanced at her and whispered, not quietly enough, "Is she new?" Vanessa laughed lightly. "Yes, she's old-fashioned." The women chuckled. Margaret placed the tray gently on the table. Vanessa gestured dismissively. "Stand there, in case we need anything." Margaret remained still. The conversation flowed, shopping trips, wedding plans, honeymoon destinations abroad. Vanessa soaked in the admiration. Her voice animated, her smile wide. Then deliberately, Vanessa reached for her glass of red wine. She took a sip, paused, and frowned. "This isn't cold enough," she said loudly. Margaret stepped forward. "I can replace it, madam." Vanessa waved her hand. Too late. She tilted the glass just slightly. The wine spilled. Not onto the table, not onto the floor, onto the cream-colored carpet. Gasps followed. Vanessa jumped to her feet dramatically. "Oh my God, look what you've done!" Margaret froze. "Madam, you spilled wine on my carpet." Vanessa shouted, her voice sharp with accusation. "Are you blind?" The guests stared. Margaret's hands trembled slightly. "I'm sorry. I will clean it immediately." Vanessa crossed her arms, satisfaction flickering briefly across her face. "On your knees. Now." The room went quiet. Aisha, standing at the doorway, felt her breath catch. Margaret hesitated for half a second, then slowly lowered herself to the floor. She knelt, reaching for a cloth. One of the guests shifted uncomfortably. "Vanessa, maybe." "No," Vanessa snapped, not taking her eyes off Margaret. "People must learn responsibility." Margaret dabbed at the stain carefully. Vanessa continued, her voice cold. "This carpet cost more than your monthly salary. Be careful before you make things worse." Margaret said nothing. Her knees pressed painfully against the hard floor. Her back ached. Her chest tightened, but her face remained calm. Minutes passed. Finally, Vanessa waved her hand. "Enough, go." Margaret rose slowly, her movements stiff. As she turned to leave, Vanessa added casually, "And after they leave, clean the entire living room again." "I don't want any smell." "Yes, madam," Margaret replied quietly. The laughter resumed, but it sounded forced now. Aisha followed Margaret into the kitchen, eyes burning. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "That was cruel." Margaret placed the cloth down her hands, shaking slightly. Cruelty often wears confidence as a mask. When the guests finally left the house, fell silent. Vanessa leaned against the couch, scrolling through her phone. "You," she called. "Come." Margaret approached slowly. Vanessa stood and looked her up and down. "You embarrassed me today." Margaret blinked. "Madam, you made my guests uncomfortable." Vanessa continued. "Next time, be less dramatic." Margaret inhaled deeply. "I did only what you asked." Vanessa stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Don't talk back to me." Margaret met her eyes briefly, just long enough to send a shiver down Vanessa's spine, then lowered her gaze. "I apologize," Vanessa scoffed. "Good." She walked away. That night, Margaret's knees swelled painfully. She moved slowly every step, a reminder of the humiliation she had endured. Daniel returned late that evening, tired from travel. "Everything okay?" he asked casually as he loosened his tie. Vanessa smiled sweetly. "Of course. Just a quiet day." Margaret passed through the hallway silently. Daniel noticed her slow gait. "Are you all right?" he asked. Margaret paused. "Yes, sir," Vanessa interrupted quickly. "She's fine. Just old." Daniel frowned, but said nothing. Later that night, as Margaret lay in bed, sleep refused to come. Her body hurt, but her mind was restless. She replayed the scene in the living room over and over, not because of the pain, but because of the pleasure she had seen in Vanessa's eyes. That was what frightened her most. Vanessa hadn't lost control. She had enjoyed it. The next morning, Margaret woke with a fever. Aisha noticed immediately. "Mama, you're not well." Margaret shook her head gently. "I'll be fine." Vanessa noticed too and rolled her eyes. "If you're sick, don't touch my things," she said sharply, "and don't expect sympathy." Margaret said nothing. As she worked slowly through the day, her vision blurred once or twice. Her steps became heavier. By afternoon, she felt dizzy. She sat down briefly on a stool in the kitchen. Vanessa walked in and froze. "Why are you sitting?" she snapped. Margaret looked up, her voice weak. "I felt faint." Vanessa scoffed. "Drama." She turned and walked away. Moments later, Margaret collapsed. Aisha screamed. The sound echoed through the house. When Margaret regained partial consciousness, she was lying on the floor. Aisha cradling her head, tears streaming down her face. Vanessa stood nearby, arms crossed. "Get her up," she said impatiently. "I don't want this mess." Aisha looked up furious. "She needs help." Vanessa shrugged. "Then call someone." Aisha reached for her phone with shaking hands. Margaret's vision blurred again. As darkness threatened to pull her under, one thought filled her mind. How much longer will this go on? She didn't know yet, but fate was already shifting. Because soon, very soon, Daniel would see what no one could hide forever. And when he did, the house that once echoed with quiet obedience would erupt with truth. Margaret woke to the steady beeping of a monitor and the sharp scent of antiseptic. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling above her was white and unfamiliar, the light too bright. Her body felt heavy, every limb aching, as though she had carried the weight of the world on her back. Then memory returned, fragment by fragment. The dizziness, the fall, Aisha's scream. She tried to sit up, but a wave of weakness forced her back onto the bed. "Easy," a calm voice said. Margaret turned her head slightly and saw a nurse standing beside her, adjusting an IV line. The nurse was young, her expression gentle. "You collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration," the nurse explained. "You're lucky your colleague acted quickly." Margaret swallowed. "How? How long have I been here?" "Since yesterday evening." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. A day lost, a day Vanessa had probably not even noticed. Moments later, the curtain beside the bed was pulled aside. Daniel stepped in. He looked different here, no suit, no confident posture. His face was tense, his eyes shadowed with worry. "Mama Maggie," he said softly. Margaret opened her eyes and met his gaze. Seeing him like this, concerned, uncertain, nearly broke her composure. "Sir," she murmured, attempting to sit up again. "Please don't," Daniel said quickly, moving closer. "The doctor said you need rest." He pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down heavily, running a hand through his hair. "I don't understand how this happened," he said. "Aisha said you've been working non-stop." Margaret hesitated. "I only do what is asked." Daniel frowned. "You shouldn't be treated like that. Not here." There it was, a crack in the wall. Margaret studied her son's face carefully. She wanted so badly to tell him everything, to reach out, take his hand, and say, "My son, look closer, listen." But she held back. "Not yet. I'm fine now," she said gently. "I don't want to cause trouble." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You didn't cause this." Before Margaret could respond, footsteps echoed outside the room. Vanessa entered, heels clicking sharply against the hospital floor. She stopped when she saw Daniel sitting beside the bed. "Oh," she said, forcing a smile. "I didn't realize you'd be here already." Daniel stood up. She collapsed Vanessa. "The doctor said she's severely exhausted." Vanessa glanced at Margaret, then shrugged lightly. "These things happen. She is old." Margaret flinched internally, but her face remained still. Daniel stared at Vanessa, disbelief creeping into his expression. "She collapsed at home, Vanessa." "At our home." Vanessa sighed. "Daniel, please. You're making this bigger than it is." Daniel didn't respond immediately. The silence grew heavy. Eventually, Vanessa checked her phone. "I have a fitting appointment. I'll come back later." She turned to leave, pausing briefly. "I hope you recover quickly," she added flatly to Margaret. When she was gone, Daniel sat back down slowly. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I should have noticed sooner." Margaret's chest tightened. "You are not responsible for everything," she said gently. Daniel shook his head. "I am responsible for my home." For the first time since arriving, he looked truly unsettled. Later that day, as Margaret rested, Daniel stepped out into the corridor to make a call. He dialed Aisha. "How bad was it?" he asked. Aisha hesitated, then spoke honestly. "Sir, it's been bad for a while." Daniel closed his eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" Aisha's voice trembled. "We were afraid." Daniel leaned against the wall, the weight of realization pressing down on him. That evening, Margaret was discharged. Daniel insisted on bringing her back to the mansion himself. As the car pulled into the driveway, Margaret felt a familiar heaviness settle in her chest. Inside, Vanessa was already waiting. She smiled brightly when Daniel entered. "You're back early." Daniel didn't return the smile. "We need to talk," he said. Vanessa's expression shifted subtly. "About what?" "About how you treat people in this house." Vanessa laughed lightly. "Daniel, now is not the time." "It is," he interrupted. Margaret stood quietly near the door, unseen but listening. "I saw her today," Daniel continued, "in a hospital bed, because she was pushed beyond her limits." Vanessa crossed her arms. "You're exaggerating." Daniel took a deep breath. "Aisha told me things." Vanessa's eyes flashed. "So now the staff are lying to you?" Daniel's voice hardened. "They're afraid of you." The words hung in the air. Vanessa scoffed. "That's ridiculous." Daniel studied her carefully, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "I want to believe you," he said slowly. but something doesn't feel right anymore. Vanessa forced a smile. You're tired, that's all. Daniel turned toward Margaret. Please go and rest. Margaret bowed her head slightly and walked away, her heart pounding. Behind her, the argument resumed in hushed but heated tones. That night, Margaret lay awake staring at the ceiling. For the first time, Daniel was questioning, listening, watching, but questioning was not enough. Truth required confrontation. The next morning, Daniel left early for work. Vanessa wasted no time reclaiming control. She stormed into the staff area, eyes blazing. You think you've won something? She snapped at Margaret, running to Daniel like a helpless old woman. Margaret looked up calmly. I said nothing to him. Vanessa leaned closer. Don't insult my intelligence. Margaret met her gaze steadily. You don't need my words to reveal yourself. Vanessa froze for a split second, then laughed sharply. You think you're clever, she said. You're nothing. She turned to Aisha, and you one more lie, and you're out. Aisha looked down, trembling. Margaret placed a gentle hand on Aisha's arm. Go, she said softly. I will handle this. Vanessa smirked. Handle what? You can barely stand. Margaret straightened slowly, her posture dignified despite her exhaustion. You mistake silence for weakness, she said calmly. Vanessa stared at her, unsettled by the quiet authority in her voice. Before she could respond, a car pulled into the driveway. Daniel was back. He entered the house unexpectedly, stopping when he sensed the tension in the room. What's going on? He asked. No one answered immediately. Margaret lowered her eyes again. Vanessa smiled tightly. Nothing, darling. Daniel's gaze lingered on Margaret, then on Aisha, then back to Vanessa. He said nothing. But in his eyes, something had shifted. Suspicion had taken root, and once planted, it would not be easily uprooted, because from this moment on, Daniel would start paying attention, and the truth, long buried under politeness and denial, was preparing to surface. From the moment Daniel returned unexpectedly that morning, the atmosphere inside the mansion shifted. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Vanessa sensed it immediately. Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not accuse her. He did not confront her openly. But he watched, quietly, closely, and for someone like Vanessa, that was far more dangerous. After Daniel left again for work, Vanessa's smile vanished the second the door closed behind him. She turned slowly toward Margaret. Her eyes were cold. So, Vanessa said, folding her arms, you think you're clever. Margaret remained still, her hands resting calmly in front of her. I think nothing, madam. Vanessa scoffed. Don't pretend. You've been playing a game since the day you arrived. Margaret lifted her gaze slightly. I have only done my work. Vanessa laughed sharply. Your work, please. You collapse once and suddenly Daniel is looking at me like I'm a monster. Margaret said nothing. Vanessa stepped closer, lowering her voice. Let me make something very clear. This house will soon be mine. And when it is, I decide who stays and who goes. Margaret met her eyes. Power borrowed is not power owned. The words slipped out before Margaret could stop herself. Vanessa froze. What did you say? She demanded. Margaret lowered her gaze again. Nothing, madam. Forgive me. But Vanessa had heard enough. Her face flushed with anger. You think because you're old, you can speak to me any way you want. She turned toward the corridor. Aisha. Aisha appeared hesitantly. Pack your things, Vanessa snapped. You're dismissed. Aisha's eyes widened. Madam, what did I do? You're stirring trouble, Vanessa said coldly. And I won't tolerate disloyalty. Margaret's heart dropped. Madam Margaret said gently, please don't punish her. She has done nothing wrong. Vanessa turned on her. You don't give orders here. Aisha's voice trembled. Sir Daniel didn't say. Vanessa raised her hand sharply. I said, pack. Tears streamed down Aisha's face as she turned away. Margaret felt a sharp pain in her chest, not physical this time, but moral. This was it. This was the line. She stepped forward, her voice steady but firm. Vanessa. Vanessa spun around. Did you just call me by my name? Yes, Margaret replied calmly, because what you are doing is wrong. For a split second, the room went silent. Then Vanessa laughed a harsh, bitter sound. You really have lost your mind, she said. Security. Before Margaret could react, 2 security guards appeared at the entrance of the staff area. Vanessa pointed at Margaret. She's causing trouble. Remove her. The guards hesitated clearly, uncomfortable. Margaret straightened her back. I will go, she said calmly. But know this truth does not need permission to exist. Vanessa rolled her eyes. Take her out. As the guards gently guided Margaret toward the door, Aisha collapsed into sobs. Mama, I'm sorry, Aisha cried. Margaret squeezed her hand briefly. Hold your head high, she whispered. Your integrity is intact. They reached the front entrance just as a familiar car pulled into the driveway. The engine cut. The door opened. Daniel stepped out. He froze. What is going on? He demanded, his eyes locking onto the scene. Before him, 2 guards holding Margaret Aisha, crying in the background, Vanessa standing stiffly behind them. Vanessa rushed forward instantly. Darling, it's nothing. The maid is being difficult. Daniel looked at Margaret. Is that true? Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it. She simply shook her head. Daniel turned to the guards. Let her go. They released her immediately. Daniel's gaze hardened as he faced Vanessa. Why was she being removed? Vanessa crossed her arms. She's disrespectful. She's turning the staff against me. Daniel's voice dropped. By collapsing from exhaustion. By getting sick. Vanessa scoffed. You're choosing her over me now. Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around at Aisha's tear-streaked face, at the guards' uneasy expressions, at Margaret, standing quietly, dignity intact despite everything. Then he said quietly, Everyone else leave us. The staff retreated. Vanessa laughed nervously. Daniel, you're overreacting. Daniel turned to Margaret. Did you say anything to provoke this? Margaret met his eyes. I asked her not to punish another person for her anger. Silence. Daniel turned slowly to Vanessa. Is that true? Vanessa hesitated, just for a moment. Then she snapped. So now I can't discipline my own staff in my own house. Daniel's jaw clenched. It is not your house. The words hit like a slap. Vanessa's face drained of color. I don't recognize you right now, Daniel continued quietly. This is not the woman I thought I knew. Vanessa's eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of remorse. They were tears of fear. You're humiliating me, she whispered. Daniel shook his head. No, you're revealing yourself. He turned to Margaret. Please, go rest. Margaret nodded slowly and walked away, her heart pounding. Behind her, Voices rose, not shouting, but sharp. That night, Vanessa locked herself in the bedroom. Daniel slept in the guest room. The house felt divided, no longer ruled by Vanessa's confidence, but by uncertainty. In her small room, Margaret sat on the bed, hands clasped tightly together. She had not planned for things to escalate this quickly. She had hoped to observe longer, to gather more truth. But Vanessa had forced the moment. Margaret whispered a prayer. May truth be gentle, even when it is painful. The next morning, Daniel knocked on Margaret's door. She opened it slowly. Can we talk? He asked. She nodded. They sat in the small room, so different from the luxurious spaces Daniel was used to. I owe you an apology, Daniel said quietly. I should have protected you. Margaret smiled softly. Protection begins with awareness. Daniel hesitated. There's something about you, something familiar. Margaret's heart skipped, but she remained calm. People are often more alike than we realize, she said. Daniel nodded slowly. I need time, he admitted, but I promise I won't ignore this anymore. Margaret placed a gentle hand over his. That is all truth ever asks for. As Daniel left the room, Margaret exhaled deeply. The test was reaching its breaking point. Vanessa's control was slipping. Daniel's eyes were opening, and the truth, once stirred, would not settle quietly again. Because the next step would require more than observation. It would require revelation. Daniel did not sleep that night. In the quiet of the guest room, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling as questions circled his mind like restless birds. Every memory of the past few weeks replayed itself, moments he had dismissed, gestures he had overlooked, silences he had misunderstood. The way the staff stiffened when Vanessa entered a room. The way conversations stopped abruptly. The fear he now recognized in Aisha's eyes. And most of all, the calm dignity of the old woman he had hired as a helper, a dignity that did not match her position. At dawn, Daniel rose and stood by the window. Lagos was already waking up, horns blaring in the distance, vendors setting up stalls, life moving forward without waiting for his confusion to clear. He dressed quietly and left the room. In the kitchen, he found Aisha preparing tea, her movements cautious, as though bracing for something. Aisha, Daniel said gently. She nearly dropped the kettle. I'm sorry, sir, she said quickly. I didn't hear you. Daniel shook his head. You don't need to apologize. I need to ask you something. Aisha hesitated, eyes darting toward the corridor that led to the bedroom wing. Daniel noticed. Vanessa is still asleep, he said. Please, just be honest with me. Aisha swallowed hard. How long has this been going on? Daniel asked. Aisha's hands trembled as she set the kettle down. Since Madame Vanessa moved in fully. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Why didn't anyone tell me? Because she always said no one would believe us, Aisha replied quietly. And because she's your fiancé. The words cut deeper than Daniel expected. What about Mama Maggie? He asked. What did she do to deserve this? Aisha shook her head. Nothing. She was kind to everyone. She even protected me. Daniel felt something twist painfully in his chest. Thank you, he said softly. You can go. Aisha nodded, relief and fear mixing in her expression. Daniel left the kitchen and walked through the house slowly, deliberately. He noticed things he had never paid attention to before. Locked doors, hidden cameras he had installed years ago for security, but rarely checked corners of the house that felt tense rather than peaceful. He stopped in front of the security room. Inside, a guard stood and saluted. "Good morning, sir." Daniel nodded. "I need access to the cameras. From the past 2 weeks." The guard hesitated only a moment. "Yes, sir." Daniel sat down in front of the screens. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Staff moving quietly. Vanessa walking confidently through the house orders being given. Then Daniel noticed patterns. Vanessa's posture changed when she thought she was unobserved. Her voice sharpened. Her gestures became abrupt, dismissive. He watched as Margaret scrubbed floors long after they were already clean. He saw Vanessa knock over a glass, deliberately, then step back, arms crossed, watching Margaret kneel. Daniel's stomach churned. He watched another clip, Vanessa threatening Aisha, finger-pointed face contorted with anger. Then another Margaret, standing protectively in front of Aisha, speaking calmly, refusing to back down. Daniel pushed his chair back slowly, his hands shaking. So this was the truth. Not rumors, not misunderstandings. Evidence. He sat there for a long time, the hum of the monitors filling the room. By the time Daniel left, the sun was fully up. Vanessa emerged from the bedroom later that morning, dressed immaculately, confidence restored. She found Daniel in the living room, standing near the window. "Good morning," she said brightly. "You look tired." Daniel turned to her slowly. "We need to talk." Vanessa sighed dramatically. Again, Daniel held her gaze. "I've seen the footage." For the first time since he had known her, Vanessa faltered. "What footage?" she asked, though her voice lacked conviction. "The cameras," Daniel replied. "All of them." Silence fell between them. Vanessa laughed nervously. "Daniel, you're spying on me now." "I was protecting my home," he said calmly. "And I failed." Vanessa's smile faded. "Those people exaggerate everything." Daniel shook his head. "I watched you humiliate her. Again and again." Vanessa's tone hardened. "So what if I corrected her?" "That's not abuse. That's management." Daniel took a step closer. "You enjoyed it." Vanessa's eyes flashed. "Don't psychoanalyze me." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Tell me something, Vanessa. If this is how you treat people who depend on you, how will you treat people who disagree with you?" Vanessa crossed her arms. "You're choosing staff over your future wife?" Daniel's voice was steady. "I'm choosing truth over denial." Vanessa laughed sharply, bitterness creeping in. "You think that old woman is innocent? You have no idea who she is." Daniel froze. "What do you mean?" Vanessa smirked. "She's been manipulating you, acting weak, playing the victim." Daniel stared at her. "You're wrong." Vanessa stepped closer, her voice low and venomous. "You think she's just some poor old maid? There's something strange about her. The way she speaks, the way she looks at you." Daniel's heart began to pound. "I want her gone," Vanessa said firmly. "Today." Daniel shook his head. "No." Vanessa's eyes widened. "What? She stays," Daniel replied. "And until I understand everything, you and I are putting the wedding plans on hold." The words landed like a bomb. Vanessa's face flushed red. "You can't be serious." "I am," Daniel said quietly. "I need time." Vanessa laughed hysterically. "After everything I've done for you," Daniel didn't respond. Vanessa's laughter turned to fury. "You'll regret this." She stormed past him, heels striking the floor angrily. Daniel remained where he was, his heart heavy but resolute. Later that afternoon, Daniel knocked gently on Margaret's door. She opened it slowly, I need to ask you something, he said. Margaret nodded. Come in. They sat facing each other in the small room. I saw the cameras, Daniel said softly. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. I see. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, pain evident in his voice. Margaret smiled sadly. Because you needed to see it yourself. Daniel leaned forward, his voice breaking. I trusted her. Margaret reached out and placed her hand over his. Trust is not a weakness. Blindness is. Daniel swallowed hard. There's something about you. The way you speak. Your strength. Margaret met his gaze, her eyes warm, filled with something deeper. Sometimes, she said gently, the people closest to us are the ones we recognize last. Daniel stared at her, a strange sense of familiarity flooding him. Who are you? He whispered. Margaret did not answer. Not yet. Outside the room, Vanessa stood silently in the hallway listening. Her expression was dark. She realized then that the ground beneath her feet was shifting and fast. The power she thought she held was slipping away. And when power begins to slip, people reveal their most dangerous selves. Vanessa turned away slowly, her mind racing. If truth was coming, she would not go down quietly. Vanessa did not confront Daniel again that day. Instead, she became unnervingly calm. Too calm. She moved through the house with a controlled smile greeting staff. With forced politeness, her voice suddenly sweet, her tone carefully measured. To anyone watching from the outside, it would have looked like a woman correcting her mistakes. But beneath the surface, something darker was forming. Margaret noticed it immediately. People who changed overnight were rarely repentant. They were strategic. That evening, Vanessa knocked on Margaret's door. The sound alone made Aisha stiffen from across the corridor. Margaret opened the door slowly. Vanessa stood there holding a tray, tea and bread neatly arranged. Her posture was stiff, her smile tight. I thought I should check on you, Vanessa said softly. Daniel said, you've been through a lot. Margaret studied her carefully. That's kind of you. Vanessa stepped inside without waiting for permission and placed the tray on the small table. I owe you an apology, she continued. I've been stressed. Wedding pressure, expectations. You understand. Margaret nodded gently. Stress reveals what we already carry. Vanessa's jaw tightened slightly, but she quickly recovered. I hope we can start fresh, Vanessa said, extending her hand. Margaret looked at the hand for a moment, then took it briefly. I hold no grudges, Margaret said calmly. Vanessa smiled relief, flickering across her face. But as she turned to leave, her eyes hardened. Later that night, Vanessa made a call. Her voice was low, urgent. Yes? I need you to do something for me, she whispered into the phone. It's about an old woman in the house. Margaret, passing quietly down the corridor, heard her name mention the maid. She stopped listening. She's dangerous, Vanessa continued. Daniel trusts her. Too much. Margaret stepped back silently. The next morning, Vanessa played her role flawlessly. She helped set the table. She thanked Aisha. She even smiled at Margaret. Daniel watched carefully, suspicion still present, but softened by hope. See, Vanessa said lightly, people can change. Daniel nodded slowly. I hope so. Margaret said nothing. That afternoon, a stranger arrived at the gate, a woman in a neatly pressed suit holding a folder. I'm here about a complaint, she said to the security guard. Regarding illegal employment. The guard frowned. Illegal employment? Yes, the woman replied. An elderly woman working without proper documentation. I was informed. She collapsed on duty. Daniel was called immediately. He stood at the gate, confusion turning to anger, as the woman introduced herself as a labor officer. Who filed this complaint? Daniel demanded. The officer hesitated. It was anonymous. Daniel's eyes flicked toward the house. Vanessa watched from the balcony, above her face, carefully composed. Margaret was called outside. She stood calmly, hands clasped, as the officer questioned her. Do you have identification? The officer asked. Margaret nodded. Yes. She reached into her bag, but paused. Daniel noticed. Mama Maggie, he said gently. What is it? Margaret looked at him. Her eyes held something heavy now, something resolved. Daniel, she said softly, there are truths that cannot be hidden forever. Vanessa's breath caught. Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, not her ID. She handed it to Daniel. What is this? He asked. Open it, she replied. Daniel hesitated, then tore it open. Inside were documents, legal papers. A familiar name printed clearly at the top. Margaret Okoye. Daniel's heart stopped. He stared at the name, then at the photograph attached, then back at the woman standing before him. Mum, he whispered. The world seemed to tilt. Vanessa staggered back from the balcony railing. The officer gasped. Madam, you're... Yes, Margaret said calmly. I am his mother. Daniel dropped the papers. Mum, he said again, louder this time. What? Why? Margaret stepped closer. Because you are about to marry a woman who believes power excuses cruelty. Daniel's chest heaved. You did all this? For me, Margaret nodded. For your future. For your soul. Vanessa rushed downstairs. This is manipulation, she shouted. She lied to everyone. Daniel turned on her, rage blazing in his eyes. You tried to have my mother arrested. Vanessa froze. I was protecting myself, she cried. She was interfering. Daniel laughed bitterly. Interfering or exposing you? The labor officer stepped back awkwardly. I'll take my leave. Daniel waved her off without looking. The house fell silent. Vanessa looked around desperately. Daniel, please. I love you. Daniel shook his head slowly. You love control. Margaret spoke softly. I gave you every chance to choose kindness. Vanessa's voice broke. You humiliated me. Margaret met her gaze. No. You humiliated yourself. Daniel straightened his voice firm. The wedding is canceled. Vanessa screamed. You can't do this to me. Daniel's voice did not waver. I already have. Security escorted Vanessa to pack her things. As she passed Margaret, she hissed, You think you've won? Margaret replied gently, I think my son has. That night, mother and son sat together in the living room, truly together, for the first time in years. I'm sorry, Daniel whispered. I didn't see. Margaret took his hands. Seeing late is better than never. Outside the city, lights flickered. Inside, a home was finally healing. But the consequences of cruelty had only just begun. The house felt strangely hollow after Vanessa left. Her laughter was gone. Her sharp heels no longer echoed across the marble floors. Even the air itself seemed lighter, as if the walls had been holding their breath for weeks and were only now allowed to exhale. Margaret sat quietly on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, watching Daniel pace back and forth across the living room. He looked shaken, not angry, not relieved. Shaken. "I can't believe it," Daniel said finally, his voice low. "All this time, it was you." Margaret lifted her eyes to him. "I never stopped being your mother." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "And I never recognized you." He stopped pacing and sat down across from her, rubbing his temples. "You cooked. You cleaned. You were humiliated in my house," he said, his voice cracking. "And I let it happen." Margaret reached out and touched his arm gently. "You didn't let it happen out of cruelty. You let it happen out of trust." Daniel looked at her sharply. "Trust almost ruined my life." Margaret shook her head. "No, blind trust almost did. Wisdom comes when trust learns to ask questions." Daniel swallowed hard. "I feel like a fool," he admitted. Margaret smiled sadly. "Every parent knows this moment will come. The moment your child realizes you cannot protect them from everything, but you can still guide them." Daniel leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "Do you know what hurts the most?" he asked quietly. "It's not that she was cruel. It's that she never thought she'd be caught." Margaret nodded. People who believe they are untouchable forget one thing: character leaves footprints. The following morning, the house buzzed with whispers. The staff gathered in small groups, exchanging glances, unsure of what the future held. No one knew whether Daniel would blame them for their silence or dismiss them for their fear. Daniel called a meeting. Everyone stood nervously in the living room as he entered. "I owe all of you an apology," he said plainly. "I failed to see what was happening under my roof." Silence filled the room. "I promise you this," Daniel continued. "No one will ever be mistreated here again. Not by anyone. Not under my name." Aisha's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. Daniel nodded. "You showed courage when it mattered." After the meeting, Daniel turned to Margaret. "I want you to move into the main house," he said firmly. "The guest suite. The one with the garden view." Margaret hesitated. "I don't need luxury." Daniel smiled faintly. "You deserve peace." Margaret agreed, not for comfort, but for closure. Later that day, Daniel received a call that made his chest tighten. It was Vanessa. Her voice was shaky, defensive. "This is getting out of hand," she said. "People are talking." Daniel's tone was cold. "They're talking because you showed them who you are." Vanessa scoffed. "You think this makes you noble?" Daniel replied calmly. "It makes me honest." She hung up. That evening, Margaret stood alone in the garden, watching the sun sink behind the trees. Daniel joined her. "I thought success meant control," he said quietly. "Now I realize it means responsibility." Margaret smiled. "Then you've learned the lesson most never do." Daniel looked at her. "Will you ever forgive me?" Margaret turned to him fully. "My son, I never stopped loving you." Forgiveness was never in question. Daniel's eyes burned. For the first time since childhood, he leaned into her embrace. The house that once echoed with power struggles now held something gentler truth. But even as healing began inside the mansion, consequences were unfolding beyond its walls. Vanessa was not done. She sat alone in her apartment, scrolling through social media, reading whispers and rumors. CEO cancels wedding after shocking revelation. Bride exposed for mistreating staff. Her hands shook. "This is not over," she muttered, "because when pride is wounded deeply enough, it does not retreat quietly. It plots." And while Daniel believed the storm had passed, another wave was already forming. One that would test not just his judgment, but his heart. Vanessa did not sleep that night. She sat on the edge of her bed in her new apartment, the city lights of Lagos glowing faintly through the window, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Every notification felt like an insult. Every headline felt like an accusation. Billionaire calls off wedding. After shocking truth. Fiancé accused of abusing staff. She threw the phone onto the bed and stood up abruptly. This was supposed to be my life, she whispered, pacing the room. My future. In her mind, the story had already been written, the grand wedding. The admiration, the power that came with being Mrs. Okoye. She had believed she was untouchable, protected by beauty status and Daniel's love. And then, an old woman had shattered everything. No, Vanessa muttered. She planned this, every part of it. The more she thought about it, the more her anger sharpened into something colder, more dangerous. Revenge. The next morning, Daniel arrived at his office early. He tried to bury himself in work meetings, contracts, phone calls, but his thoughts kept drifting back to his mother, to the sight of her kneeling on the floor, to the realization that it had happened under his roof. Around midday, his assistant knocked. "Sir, there's a woman here asking to see you," she said hesitantly. "She says it's urgent." Daniel frowned. "Did she give a name?" "She says, Vanessa Adebayo." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Tell her I'm unavailable." The assistant nodded and left. But minutes later, his phone rang. Unknown number. Against his better judgment, Daniel answered. "What do you want?" he asked flatly. Vanessa's voice came through trembling, not with sadness, but with fury barely contained. "You think you can destroy me and walk away?" she demanded. Daniel sighed. "Vanessa, this conversation is over." "No, it's not," she snapped. "Your mother humiliated me in front of everyone. She turned you against me." Daniel's voice hardened. "My mother revealed the truth. You did the rest yourself." There was a brief silence, then Vanessa laughed. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. "People like me don't just disappear." Daniel hung up. Back at the mansion, Margaret sensed the unease before she understood it. She sat in the garden with a cup of tea, enjoying the quiet she had not felt in weeks. Aisha joined her, relaxed for the first time in a long while. "Mama," Aisha said softly, "do you think she will come back?" Margaret looked up at the sky. People who lose power often try to reclaim it in dangerous ways. As if summoned by her words, the gate buzzer sounded. The security guard's voice crackled through the intercom. "Madam, there is a woman here insisting on entry. She says she has something important to say." Margaret's heart sank slightly. "What is her name?" Aisha asked. The guard hesitated. "Vanessa Adebayo." Aisha stiffened. "She has no right. Let her in," Margaret said calmly. Aisha stared at her. Mama Margaret placed her cup down. Some storms must be faced, not avoided. Moments later, Vanessa marched into the garden. Her expression carefully composed, sunglasses hiding her eyes. She removed them slowly, her gaze locking onto Margaret. "So," Vanessa said coolly, "here you are, enjoying the life you stole." Margaret stood slowly, her posture straight, her voice calm. "No one stole anything from you, Vanessa?" Vanessa laughed bitterly. "You ruined me." Margaret shook her head. I gave you opportunities to choose kindness. You chose cruelty. Vanessa stepped closer. You think exposing me makes you righteous. Margaret met her gaze. I think it protects my son. Vanessa's lips curled. Your son is weak. Aisha gasped. Margaret's eyes hardened, but only briefly. Leave, Margaret said quietly. Before you say something you cannot take back. Vanessa smiled coldly. Oh, I already have. She pulled a folded document from her bag and thrust it forward. I filed a lawsuit, Vanessa said. Defamation, emotional distress, abuse of power. Aisha cried out. That's madness. Margaret took the document, calmly scanning it. Vanessa leaned in. Let's see how noble you look when the courts get involved. Margaret folded the paper neatly and handed it back. You are free to do what you believe is right, Margaret said. But remember, truth does not fear investigation. Vanessa scoffed. We'll see. She turned sharply and walked away. That evening, Daniel returned home to find his mother unusually quiet. She came here, Margaret said gently when he asked. She's planning to fight. Daniel's shoulders sagged. I was afraid of that. Margaret touched his hand. Do not fear accountability, my son. Fear compromise of character. The lawsuit made headlines within days. Vanessa painted herself as a victim, claiming manipulation, humiliation, betrayal. Some media outlets eagerly picked it up, hungry for drama. Daniel's board of directors expressed concern. This could damage the company, one warned. Daniel listened calmly. Then we will respond with the truth. Margaret insisted on one thing. I will testify, she said firmly. Daniel protested. Mom, you don't have to. Yes, I do, Margaret replied, because silence is what allowed her behavior to grow. The court date was set. On the morning of the hearing, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Vanessa arrived dressed impeccably. Confidence restored, cameras flashing as she stepped inside. Margaret entered quietly through a side door, dressed simply, her face serene. When Margaret took the stand, the room fell silent. She spoke slowly, clearly, without anger. She described her decision, her observations, the humiliation she endured not to accuse but to reveal. She spoke of kindness, of responsibility, of the danger of power without compassion. When Vanessa's lawyer tried to paint her as manipulative, Margaret answered calmly. I did not pretend to be weak, she said. I revealed who she was when she believed no one important was watching. The judge listened intently. Then the footage was played. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as Vanessa's actions unfolded on screen. The truth undeniable and unforgiving. Vanessa's confidence cracked. By the end of the day, the judge dismissed the case. Outside the courthouse, Vanessa stood alone, reporters calling out questions she could no longer answer. Daniel walked beside his mother, shielding her from the crowd. As they reached the car, Margaret paused. Vanessa, she said softly. Vanessa looked up, eyes blazing. I pray one day you understand that power is not control, Margaret said. It is care. Vanessa said nothing. The car drove away. That night, back at the mansion, Daniel sat beside his mother. It's over, he said quietly. Margaret smiled gently. No, my son, it's complete. Because sometimes justice does not roar. It stands calmly and lets the truth speak for itself. The days after the court ruling felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful quiet. It was the kind of silence that follows a storm when debris still lies scattered and everyone moves carefully, unsure what might still collapse. For Daniel, The victory did not feel triumphant. It felt sobering. At Okoye, developments, whispers followed him through the corridors. Some employees looked at him with renewed respect. Others looked away, unsure how to behave around a man whose private life had so publicly unraveled. In the boardroom, one of the senior directors finally spoke, the thought hanging in the air. "You did the right thing," Mr. Attawell said carefully. "But public perception is fragile." Daniel nodded. "So is integrity." The room went silent. After the meeting, Daniel returned home early. The mansion, once a symbol of success, now felt like a place he needed to relearn. In the garden, he found his mother sitting beneath the mango tree, reading quietly. "Mom," he said, sitting beside her, "do you ever regret it?" Margaret closed the book slowly. "Regret protecting you." Daniel shook his head. "Regret the way you did it, the pain you endured." Margaret smiled faintly. "Pain is temporary. Character is permanent." Daniel exhaled deeply. "I keep thinking, what if you hadn't done this?" Margaret met his eyes. "Then you would have married cruelty and called it love." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. Memories of Vanessa replayed her laughter, her charm the version of her he thought he knew. He realized something that unsettled him deeply. He hadn't loved Vanessa. He had loved the image of stability she represented, the future she promised, the idea of completeness, and that realization hurt more than betrayal. The next morning, Daniel made a decision. He called a company-wide meeting. Hundreds of employees gathered in the auditorium, confusion buzzing in the air. When Daniel stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. "I won't take much of your time," he began, "but I need to say this clearly." He paused. "What happened in my home happened under my authority, and for that I take responsibility." Murmurs rippled through the room. "I allowed respect to be confused with fear," Daniel continued, "and I allowed silence to protect the wrong behavior." He straightened. "From today onward, Okoye Developments will operate under one rule: no one is untouchable. Not managers, not executives, not me." The room erupted in applause. Later that day, Daniel visited the staff quarters. Aisha froze when she saw him approach. "Sir," she said quickly, lowering her head. Daniel raised a hand gently. "Look at me." She did. "Thank you," he said simply, "for your courage." Aisha's eyes filled with tears. "I was afraid." "I know," Daniel replied, "and I'm sorry you ever had to be." That evening, Daniel found his mother in the kitchen of all places helping prepare dinner. "Mom," he protested lightly, "you don't have to do this anymore." Margaret smiled. "I want to. Service should never feel like punishment." Daniel watched her quietly, then said, "I don't trust myself anymore." Margaret paused. "Why?" "Because I miss so much," he admitted. "I don't know how to choose right." Margaret turned to face him fully. "Wisdom is not the absence of mistakes," she said. "It is the humility to learn from them." Daniel nodded slowly. Days later, Vanessa appeared again, but not in person. A letter arrived. It was short, bitter, defensive. "You think you've won, but people like me always rise again." Daniel read it once, then handed it to his mother. Margaret read it calmly and placed it aside. "Bitterness is a heavy burden," she said. "Let her carry it alone." Daniel realized then that his mother had already moved on, not from the pain, but beyond it. That realization changed him. He began to notice things he had ignored before. How cleaners arrived earlier than executives. How drivers waited long after meetings ended. How security guards stayed alert through the night. He began greeting them by name, listening, asking. One afternoon, while leaving the office, Daniel saw a young woman arguing with a security guard at the gate. She was upset, clutching a folder. "I just want to submit my application," she said. "I've been turned away 3 times. Daniel intervened gently. "What's the issue?" The guard explained policy. The woman's shoulders sagged. Daniel took the folder. "Come tomorrow morning," he said to her. "I'll make sure someone listens." As the woman walked away, grateful and stunned, Daniel felt something unfamiliar but grounding: purpose. That night, Daniel spoke quietly to his mother. "I want to change how I lead," he said. "Not just at home, everywhere." Margaret nodded. "Then start where you are." He did. Months passed. The scandal faded from headlines. Vanessa disappeared from public view, her voice replaced by silence. But the impact of her actions remained in lessons learned, in systems restructured, in a man reshaped. Daniel canceled all wedding plans permanently, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. One evening, as they sat together, watching the city lights, Daniel asked softly, "Will you ever trust someone again, Mum? After what you saw in me?" Margaret turned to him, eyes warm. "I never lost trust in you. I trusted the truth to reach you." Daniel smiled sadly. "And if it hadn't," Margaret squeezed his hand, "then I would have kept standing in your way until it did." Daniel laughed quietly. In that moment, he understood something profound. Love was not blind support. Love was courageous interference. And sometimes the greatest act of love was to let someone see themselves without excuses. The storm had passed, but what it left behind was stronger than what existed before. Time has a way of exposing what remains after emotion fades. For Daniel, the weeks that followed were not filled with dramatic confrontations or public apologies. Instead, they were marked by something far more difficult: quiet accountability. He returned to his routines, but nothing felt the same. Every decision now carried weight. Every interaction felt like a test of the man he was becoming. One afternoon, as Daniel sat in his office reviewing contracts, his phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. He hesitated, then answered. "Daniel Okoye," a man's voice said politely. "My name is Mr. Balogan. I represent Vanessa Adebayo." Daniel's jaw tightened. "What does she want now?" The lawyer cleared his throat. "My client wishes to reach a private settlement. She is willing to issue a formal apology in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement." Daniel leaned back in his chair, stunned not by the request, but by the emptiness he felt hearing her name again. "No," he said calmly. There was a pause. "Sir, no settlement, no silence," Daniel repeated. "The truth doesn't need to be hidden." The call ended. When Daniel told his mother later that evening, she nodded approvingly. "Silence purchased by fear is not peace," Margaret said. "It's surrender." Meanwhile, Vanessa's world continued to unravel. The social circle that once adored her grew distant. Invitations stopped coming. Friends avoided her calls. Sponsors withdrew quietly, not wanting to be associated with controversy. For the first time, Vanessa experienced something unfamiliar. Invisibility. She sat alone in a cafe one afternoon, scrolling through photos from her past life events. Luxury trips, carefully curated smiles. Each image felt like a reminder of what she had lost. It wasn't supposed to end like this, she muttered. And yet deep down, she knew it wasn't the ending. It was the consequence. Back at the mansion, Margaret noticed subtle changes in her son. Daniel listened more than he spoke. He paused before making decisions. He questioned his instincts instead of assuming they were right. One evening, Daniel joined his mother in the garden again. "Mom," he said quietly, "do you believe people can change?" Margaret considered the question carefully. Yes, but only if they stopped defending who they were. Daniel nodded slowly. "I keep thinking about Vanessa," he admitted. "Not with anger, with confusion." Margaret smiled gently. "Confusion is the doorway to growth." Daniel exhaled. "I'm afraid of repeating the same mistake." Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder. "Fear that teaches is wisdom. Fear that controls is cowardice." The following week, Daniel visited a charity foundation his company supported. It was a small organization working with domestic workers, women who had endured years of silent mistreatment. As Daniel listened to their stories, something shifted deeply within him. One woman spoke softly, eyes downcast. "Most of us stay because we have no choice. If we speak, we lose everything." Daniel felt a familiar ache in his chest. After the meeting, he pulled the director aside. "I want to do more than donate money," Daniel said. "I want protection systems, legal support, hotlines." The director looked surprised. "That would change lives," Daniel nodded. "It should." When he returned home and told Margaret, her eyes shone. "This," she said, "is how pain becomes purpose." Meanwhile, Vanessa reached her breaking point. She stood in front of her mirror one evening, staring at a woman she barely recognized. The confidence was gone. The arrogance cracked. She remembered Margaret's words in the courtroom. "Power is not control, it is care." For the first time, Vanessa wondered if she had ever truly cared for anyone beyond herself. The thought terrified her. In a rare moment of humility, Vanessa picked up her phone and typed a message to Daniel. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I need to say this: I was wrong." Daniel read the message in silence. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he showed it to his mother. Margaret read it carefully, then handed the phone back. "Forgiveness is not reconciliation," she said. "You may forgive her without reopening the door." Daniel nodded. He replied with one sentence. "I hope you learn from this." That was all. As months passed, the scars left by the ordeal slowly softened. The house regained warmth. Laughter returned, not forced, but genuine. Aisha was promoted to head of household staff, her confidence blossoming. One evening, as Daniel prepared to leave for an international conference, he paused by his mother's door. "Mom," he said. "What if I never marry?" Margaret smiled. "Then make your life worthy of love anyway." Daniel laughed softly. "You always have answers." Margaret shook her head. "No, I just have faith." On the flight that night, Daniel looked out the window as the city lights faded below. He thought about power love and the kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind. He knew one thing for certain now. Character mattered more than charm. Kindness mattered more than status. And truth, no matter how painful, was always the better companion. Because in the end, the consequences of cruelty were unavoidable. But so were the rewards of courage. The season of testing had ended, but the season of rebuilding had only just begun. Daniel returned from his conference a quieter man, less impressed by applause, less distracted by admiration. The world had shown him its polished side for years, but now he understood how easily polish could hide rot. Back home, the mansion no longer felt like a stage. It felt like a home. Margaret had changed too, not in strength, but in posture. She walked freely now, no longer carrying the invisible weight of pretense. Staff greeted her with respect, not fear. Aisha often joined her in the evenings, listening closely as Margaret shared lessons that sounded simple but carried deep truth. One evening, Daniel joined them. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about the test you gave me." Margaret looked up. "It was never a test for you alone." Daniel nodded. "It tested who I chose to listen to, who I protected, who I ignored." He paused. "I failed at first." Margaret smiled gently. "Failure is only permanent when pride refuses to learn." Daniel exhaled relief, softening his shoulders. Later that week, Daniel made a public announcement, not about his private life, but about values. At a company-wide forum, he stood before employees and partners. "From this day forward," he said, "Okoye developments will be measured not only by profit, but by how we treat the least powerful among us." Policies were rewritten, anonymous reporting systems installed, managers retrained. People noticed, not just within the company, but beyond it. Margaret watched quietly from the audience, tears shining in her eyes, not of pride alone, but of peace. Meanwhile, Vanessa's story faded from public view. She moved cities, changed circles, lost the attention she once fed on. But in that silence, something unexpected happened. Reflection. One evening, alone in her apartment, Vanessa replayed the moment Margaret had knelt on the floor, quiet, dignified, unbroken. For the first time, shame outweighed anger. Not the shame of being exposed, but the shame of having been that person. Whether she would truly change, no one knew. But the seed had been planted. Back at the mansion, Daniel sat beside his mother under the same mango tree where so many truths had surfaced. "I'm grateful," he said softly, "even for the pain." Margaret nodded. Pain that teaches is mercy in disguise. Daniel smiled. "If I ever choose someone again, I'll choose differently." Margaret squeezed his hand. "Choose someone who is kind when no one is watching." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not the loud, reckless kind, but the steady kind. The kind built on awareness, humility, and truth. Because the greatest inheritance Margaret gave her son was not wealth or status or protection. It was sight, and with sight, Daniel could now build a future that would not collapse under its own pride, one rooted in dignity, strengthened by compassion, guided by truth. This story reminds us that true character is revealed not by how we treat those who can benefit us, but by how we treat those who cannot fight back. Power without compassion becomes cruelty. Love without discernment becomes blindness. And silence when it protects wrongdoing, becomes a form of betrayal. Kindness is not weakness. It is strength in its purest form. And truth, no matter how long it hides, always finds a way to surface. Sometimes through pain, sometimes through courage, and sometimes through the quiet sacrifice of those who love us enough to intervene. If this story touched your heart, ask yourself, how do I treat people when I think no one important is watching? What kind of legacy am I building through my actions, not my words? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters here. And if you believe stories like this can change hearts and open eyes, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and walk this journey of truth, hope, and humanity with us.